There you go. Okay. Okay. We are now recording. And this is sort of basically the first slide. So, as I said, I'm a research assistant with the State Systems team, a third-year PhD student. My academic background is in gender studies, and I kind of pivoted toward an interest in public policy. I have an MPP that has a concentration in health policy from the Heller School at Brandeis. In terms of my personal experience, I guess I would say that I'm like immersed day-to-day in the trans community because I identify as transgender, and my pronouns are gender-neutral pronouns, that is they, them, and their. And I want to emphasize or just take a moment to say that there's no reason for anybody who didn't know that to feel bad. There was no mechanism really for me to assert my pronouns without making it a sting, you know, like a big deal kind of, or at least that's how I felt, right? That to come out or express my pronouns in a way that diverted time and energy away from my work. So it's just that little bit of struggle is part of why I wanted to give this presentation, to start this conversation about how to facilitate a culture where folks are able to share their background and their gender identity in this workplace. I also want to say that while I'm an expert in my own experience, as everybody is an expert on their own experience, I am not an expert on trans inclusion as a matter of workplace policy. I'm not a consultant, right? And as we continue this conversation that we're starting, it might be worthwhile in the future to enlist the help of trans people who are experts or consultants in this kind of field, right, in sort of drafting and implementing workplace policy. And also to seek a diversity of trans voices and experiences, because I'm just one person and anybody is just one person. And I don't want to contribute to kind of the dominance of white trans masculine voices that tends to happen in these kinds of conversations. As I said, there's a diversity of trans experiences and everybody's voices should be included in these kinds of conversations. I'm sure that folks, this is a little bit of a tangent, but I'm sure that folks are familiar with statistics on, or at least you have some familiarity with statistics on violence against trans people, and may be aware that the kind of violence that is brought up in those kinds of statistics, in fact, is committed against trans women or trans feminine people of color, predominantly Black, Latina, and Indigenous trans women. So, there's an asymmetry in terms of the visibility of folks who are the victims of violence and the people who are the actual sort of centered voices and leadership in trans inclusion, and that's something to be corrected, I think, and worked on, that asymmetry. So moving on with my presentation.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, you may. Please.
What were you saying was the dominant voice?
So folks who tend to be like the executive directors of trans outreach organizations, the kinds of people who are doing this kind of trans 101 presentation for workplaces and organizations, tend statistically or demographically to be white and to be trans masculine or trans men, okay, as opposed to people of color generally, and also trans women. Okay. So there's a little bit of a misalignment there, or like I said, sort of an asymmetry or some, so an inequality. So that's something that I do not want to contribute to. That's why I'm emphasizing the need to have a diversity of trans voices and perspectives that represent the full breadth of trans experiences. Does that answer your question? Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about terminology. I'm not going to get as much into terminology as some similar presentations might, but we're going to cover some terms. So to start with, can anybody tell me what transgender or trans means? And folks online, if you want to jump in too. Just jump in. What does trans mean?
Sorry.
No, go ahead. So we have transition of gender.
I was just going to say someone whose gender identity doesn't match the gender assigned to them at birth.
Okay, good. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Any other definitions?
Potentially individuals who use their experience as falling outside the gender binary.
Mm-hmm. Good. So folks really already know what trans means, right? So it's an adjective that covers everything that folks have already said. It's a person whose gender is different from the gender that they were assigned at birth. It's often colloquially shortened to trans, so we say trans people when we're referring to transgender people. These are just some examples of how it's used as an adjective. So a trans woman would be a woman who was assigned male at birth, and I'll get into sex assignment and what that means. And folks who are non-binary or agender or gender fluid, or as Cedric just said, folks who may identify as outside of the binary may also identify as transgender. So it encompasses all of these experiences. By the same, where is it? Okay. By the same token, I guess, can folks tell me what cisgender means, or cis?
So that means that your gender identity matches the assignment you were given at birth.
Okay, yeah. Any other thoughts, any other definitions?
Also that you identify with one gender on the binary or the other.
Yeah, that could be. So yeah, again, cisgender is another adjective that describes the experiences that we've just talked about. So someone whose gender is the same gender that they were assigned at birth. There are binary trans people, which is to say that there are many trans people who just identify as a woman or as a man or as an identity within the gender binary. But I do think it is often implied that if you're cis, your identity is binary. But of course, it depends, I think, on your cultural context, right? Whether you live in a binaristic context. But yeah, so those are the basic definitions of trans and cis, and everybody seems to be familiar with that already, so that's good. This is getting into birth assignments. Yes, go ahead.
Just a quick question in the previous slide. So those who would identify as gender fluid or non-binary still kind of exist under the umbrella of transgender?
We might. I don't want to give a blanket statement and say that everybody who's non-binary or has an identity that's outside of sort of the dominant gender binary is trans, because folks may not identify as such, but often, I say this is true, that folks identify, folks who are non-binary and identify as such will also identify as transgender, and will treat transgender as kind of an umbrella identity.
Okay, thanks.
Does that make sense? Things do get a little bit fuzzy in terms of folks' identities, right? Like there's not like hard and fast universal rules. Is that good? Is that a satisfactory answer?
Thank you, yeah.
Okay. So sex assignment or sex assigned at birth is preferred parlance among trans folks for describing the gender that was assigned to people when they were born. So I have a lot to say about this. Just as a note, some people, so the terminology here of sex assignment is often expressed as acronyms. So AFAB would be if you're assigned female at birth, AMAB would be if you're assigned male at birth. Some folks put a C in front of the acronym to make explicit the fact that birth assignment is imposed on people coercively, right? Folks don't have a choice in their birth assignment because it's generally applied to folks when they're infants or even before they're born. And I just want to pause here to explicate a little bit about sex as an idea and gender as an idea, because in other Trans 101 type presentations, you might see or you might have seen people going to considerable lengths to describe sex and gender as totally separate and discrete concepts, right? They're kind of presented as, oh, you probably think of sex and gender as roughly the same, but actually they're very different. I think that I understand, I think, why they do that, like what the motivation is, and I'm sympathetic to it. But I trust this group generally at ICI enough to try a little bit of Trans 201 on you. All right. So I guess we're sort of in a classroom now. And this is based obviously on my own perspective, right? This is me introducing some degree of bias, so it's engaging in a conversation. So I understand sex and gender to be not really separate, but to be very closely intertwined. Specifically sex as part of gender. And I think that all of us are capable of understanding that because all of us have an assigned, well, this is an assumption, right, that all of us have an assigned sex, so at least many people do, or most people do. And that all of us live within a society where the dominant culture organizes itself around gender. So just to try and illustrate that for you, like that understanding of sex as part of or as an iteration of gender, and try to make it clearer, hopefully, I'll just pose a question to the group, or a couple questions, which are, why do we assign infants as male or female? And what kinds of decisions do we make for children based on that assignment? So that's those are open questions for folks to think about and share any answers you might have. So again, why do we assign infants as male or female? And what kinds of decisions or actions do we take related to children based on that assignment? Katie?
I think in part that it's that we take our culture is very bureaucratic, and that we need to, assign people to like simple kind of well-defined categories, and we do that in so many aspects of our life. And I think gender is one of those examples where a binary was made out of something that's really more like a continuum and messy, not clear.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, just jump in, go ahead.
I will also say culture, also from where I come from, it is actually just culture that when a child is born, defined male or female, and then that also leads us to us making the next decision on how they are socialized, as a boy or as a girl.
Right, yeah.
And then there's also the medical implications, so the organs and medical care, and so categorizing people by what their health needs are, their health awarenesses need to be.
Right.
I think making those assignments is also very natural because it's one of the few distinguishing characteristics of an infant.
Yeah, often. Yeah, okay. Any other thoughts? Any other perspectives?
Some people have written in the chat box, so you might want to read. Or if you want me to read them, I can read them, but if it's harder to see the whole chat box.
You see Frank's and Jamie's. Are there others?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes. Can you start from the top for us?
Sure. Rick Kugler said religion probably has some influence. Jonathan Kelleher said, I agree with Katie, who was talking about the bureaucratic structures. And then Frank Smith said, because people like to reinforce dominant paradigms. And Jamie Timmons said, I think the binary structure was designed to create a simple order as a way to organize one aspect of the world.
Yeah, great. So folks have described kind of many different dimensions of sex assignments and how it fits into society. And I'm glad that you brought up sort of how sex assigning male and female at birth is sort of directly feeding into socialization, right? Because we say it's a boy, it's a girl, and then make decisions about what a boy is supposed to be like and how they're supposed to behave, right? Boys are supposed to grow up to be men. Girls are supposed to behave and act a certain way, and they're supposed to grow up to be women. So that assignment of male and female has all these sort of bureaucratic and medical dimensions to it, certainly, but it also serves an important social function, which is assigning folks to a gender role when they're infants and sort of ensuring that they're fitting into a certain social order. So that's what I was talking about when I talked about sex as an iteration of gender, and hopefully that's more clear now. I mean, hopefully folks sort of get it. So there are terms that I already brought up: non-binary, agender, gender fluid. Two-spirit is one identity that comes out of indigenous communities and populations, and there are any number of terms and identities that folks may use if they identify as being outside of the gender binary, or as having no gender, or as moving between different genders. And all of these folks may also fall under the umbrella term of transgender, so they may also identify as transgender. So that's just another sort of set of identities that need to be included and considered and that you may encounter.
And Jonathan Kelleher had a comment in the chat box that the baby shower is either for a boy or a girl, just kind of reinforcing the idea that
exactly.
the assignment starts before the baby shower.
It does, right? Like the baby shower, and then even or afterwards, you know, like it's a boy or it's a girl, right? Yeah, have this whole culture and ritual around it. There we go. I actually struggled with whether or not even to include this slide because I would hope that folks, I mean, I would trust folks here at ICI, right, not to use slurs against people. But just in case, the T slur is like the big one, like the big slur against trans people. I'm not going to say it, but just in general, like don't use it to describe anyone. You probably shouldn't say it at all if you're not trans. And then also I wanted to mention something that is kind of the reason why I harped so much on sex as being part of gender, is that there's this language that folks might use, even if they're totally well-intentioned, right? Terms like biologically male or female, or like bio man or woman to refer to cis people, various terms that naturalize cisness, so like center cis identity and experiences as being the natural state from which trans identities are deviating. And then folks might also use language that refers to trans people by their assigned sex, you know, referring to trans women as male, for example, that undermines the validity of their gender. So cis women are women, and also trans women are women, period, for example. We want to avoid language that, as I said, essentializes or naturalizes cisness and that undermines the reality of trans people's genders. So moving into surveying trans people, hopefully, so these examples that I'll bring up are based on my own conversations with other trans people and also with sociologists who include trans populations in their surveys and in their studies. So hopefully you understand now why, for the purposes of a demographic survey, asking someone's gender and asking whether or not they're trans are really two distinct questions, right? Like a person might be a trans man, which means that they're a man, but he's also transgender. So he would answer affirmatively as to whether he's a man, and might also answer affirmatively as to whether or not he's transgender. Those are two different things. The structure of how you ask questions like that will necessarily be informed by why you're asking the question, why do you want to know that, and what you intend to do with the information that you're gathering. So I just have a couple examples. So this example is for, let's say, if you wanted to do a demographic survey of a workplace or an organization, you want to do it because you want to sort of tally the number of individuals who identify themselves as transgender, so you have an understanding of the demographic makeup of the population. And the purpose would be to sort of evaluate the ratio of trans employees as part of some larger effort to address diversity. So you might ask, you know, as two separate questions, what is your gender, with an option for man, an option for woman, and you want to have, if you're asking it this way, right, an option for another gender identity with a write-in, I would say, because there's such a diversity of ways in which people might identify if they don't identify as a man or a woman. You could also frame this as only a write-in question. You know, there are different options. But just the emphasis I want to make is that asking whether someone identifies as transgender would be a separate question. You identify as transgender. You want to tally the number of people who identify as trans.
Caro,
yeah.
Go ahead. I was going to ask a question about, and I think it might have to do with noun versus adjective, but what is your gender, man, woman versus male, female? Is there
I don't know enough about what's required. Like if there are federal requirements that the language is always male or female, right. What they really mean is man or woman. Right. So if you have to conform to existing language, I think folks we generally sort of understand that male really means like, are you a man? Yeah. You know. So yeah, I think there's flexibility around that.
So do you think man and woman is preferred?
Personally,
okay.
I guess yes, because it's more clear, right? But colloquially, yeah, we conflate male and female with man and woman, and again, it's another way in which sort of sex is gender, right? So yeah, like I said, I think there's flexibility around the terminology you're using based on the parameters and what you need survey information for.
And Frank says Census Bureau uses male, female to provide
no other options.
options.
Yep.
And Amy says, I like making it an open-ended response format.
And I
Yeah.
also said that I usually just ask an open-ended question, what is your gender? I mean, I do qualitative research, so it's, easy to do that.
Yeah.
I'm also like the researcher in me is like on the scale of the census. Just how many man hours would it take to translate those open-ended responses into male versus female, which 99% of the bubble
It's definitely more work, but then you're capturing more accurately.
It probably depends on the scope of what you're trying.
Right. Yeah. Those size of population too.
Can
Yeah.
question that I've always had about, race ethnicity as well. But to me, there's a real difference between doing a survey to try to understand how other people see the respondent versus what the respondent knows about themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Because often what people know about themselves is not apparent to other people. And sometimes what we're measuring is, like, if we're looking for patterns of discrimination, what we're really looking for is, how a person is perceived, and not what a person knows about themselves. And I feel like a lot of research really doesn't deal with that issue, but in terms of methods, is that?
No, I think that's a great
over into this.
I think so, yeah. I think that's a great point about how the reason why you're asking questions necessarily shapes the form of those questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That it's
So, yeah.
often just people are just asked a category
Right.
without the question.
Right.
How do you think people perceive you and what do you know about yourself?
Mhm. Like for the purpose of something like a census, I think that you're asking how people see themselves. But like you were saying, for the purpose of a study where you're like, how are people experiencing discrimination? You're right. You might want to write questions differently in order to capture that perception, as opposed to just asking folks for how they identify. I did have another example that's trying to get more into how something more sociological, like you're talking about, might frame these questions. Again, these are not like firm recommendations, right? These are how questions might look. So this is for the purpose of maybe for a study where you're comparing trans experience with other variables, trying to synthesize knowledge about whatever your target population is. You might ask, these are possible questions again, right? You might ask, and this is from a discussion with a sociologist who surveys trans folks, what is the gender on your birth certificate, like the gender marker? And then folks can mark male or female. You might leave a space for another gender marker if you're in a place where that might exist. And then ask what's your gender identity, and then ask if you identify as transgender, and then you're getting information about whether or not someone's current gender identity, like quote unquote, matches what is marked on their birth certificate, and whether or not they identify as transgender. So you're, like, you see how you're getting a little bit more information about how people see themselves. The person might answer in a way where there is a misalignment between what has been marked on their birth certificate and how they perceive themselves, but they might not identify as trans. And then you're capturing that in a survey that is structured like this. I guess for the first question, as I'm looking at it, like, people can change legally the marker on their birth certificate. You don't have to be more clear, like when you were born, what was the marker on your birth certificate. But basically, I just like to illustrate a survey that, like I said, is capturing a little bit more about the internal process of the population that you're looking at. It's sort of more sociological than just a census. Does that make sense to folks? Mm-hmm. Those are just some examples. So transitioning into something a little bit different, we're going to talk, I think like I said, I'm going to try to start a conversation about trans inclusion, because I'm not an expert, but there, I was able to refer to, and I hope that other folks also refer to, a couple sources of model policies. So this image is hyperlinked to the Transgender Law Center's template for a workplace policy that's inclusive of trans people. It's nice and succinct if folks want to take a look at it. Also down here, there's a hyperlink on the bottom in pink. There's a hyperlink to the Human Rights Campaign's toolkit for employers about transgender inclusion in the workplace. And that toolkit is much more comprehensive. It covers in detail things like privacy and records, the nature of healthcare benefits for employees. So, over here on the right-hand side of the slide, I'm sort of bringing up topics that a workplace needs to consider if it's going to, sit down and make a policy pertaining to trans inclusion. Because being transgender might entail medical transition and medical interventions, HIPAA might apply to folks' records. So, people need to be aware of the legal implications as well as just the general fact of privacy for the sake of respect, right? Respecting people's privacy. And that also pertains to healthcare benefits. Although for like ICI, I don't know if we're like bound by the university's benefit package. I have no idea actually. But again, something to consider in general for workplaces. And then pronouns
sounds like a state package.
The state package, right? The state. All right.
It's like
is the state institution state funded. There might not be flexibility around that, but again, something to consider. And then also pronouns in terms of address, and this is sort of maybe more of a cultural thing. So you can articulate a policy that says you have to respect people's pronouns, but you might have a system in place for, I don't know, I guess how people share their pronouns or how they share their terms of address. Like, for example, there are workplaces where it's kind of normalized for folks to put their terms of address and or their pronouns in their email signatures so that people know how to refer to them in correspondence. Excuse me. I was recently at a workshop on trans inclusion where one of the students who was participating brought up the fact that on Wiser, the sort of system for the university, there's a space to put in your preferred name, but there's no space to put in your preferred pronouns. And the idea of like if you're using an online system, putting in a space for pronouns that maybe other folks can refer to it, if you have a system like that, is something to think about. Access to gender segregated spaces is a big thing that's brought up right in the general discourse around transgender issues, including but not necessarily limited to restrooms. Frank Smith encountered a sign in Veggie Galaxy, which I'm not able to put on the screen, but I'm going to read it to you. So Veggie Galaxy is a restaurant in Cambridge, and they have a sign near the restrooms that says, Veggie Galaxy supports trans people. Please use the bathrooms that best fits your gender identity. If you experience any form of harassment in our bathrooms, please inform a staff member. Thank you. And Frank sort of offered that as a possible example of just a gesture or a way in which a workplace or any other space might demonstrate that they're welcoming and inclusive of trans people, that people are to look and say, okay, I know that that folks are making an effort to be inclusive and have a little bit more security in terms of the culture of the space. And then things like dress code, staff culture, just different areas or realms of employment to consider in drafting a policy.
You got a comment?
Yes.
Recently corresponding with someone from HR at UMass, and their email signature had preferred pronoun.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I don't know if that's like a policy thing that they're moving toward at UMass, but yeah, that's an example, a good example of.
Where does it get listed? Like, how does it? So we're all familiar with signatures. Is it a parenthetical? Is it how is it? Does it matter?
I don't think it matters.
Okay.
I've seen it just in different places and in different ways.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's like a standard way of how you present it.
Okay.
I guess Google does that. That's what I've heard. So again, that's like sort of one strategy. So just these are some resources. This is a very truncated list, a brief list of resources around trans issues and trans inclusion. Fenway Health is obviously a healthcare related organization, but they do sort of a lot of outreach. The Mass Trans Political Coalition is great. Their executive director was the gentleman who presented the Trans 101 workshop that I just went to at the university a couple weeks ago. And he was very amenable to, like, if at any point I wanted to bring him or someone from that organization in to give a more detailed presentation, he was amenable to that, or just generally available. There are a couple big surveys. So the National Center for Transgender Equality's report of the U.S. Transgender Survey is an excellent source if you want general information about the transgender population in the United States. It covers a variety of issues from employment, to housing, to healthcare, to experiences in school, experiences of violence, poverty. Basically, any major dimension of human life is covered in this survey of, I don't know about multiple thousands of participants, I can't remember the exact number, but over 1,000 participants. So they have a reasonably large sample population from throughout the United States. They're all adults. The youngest age group in the survey is 18 to 24. There are surveys that cover transgender students in schools. There's Gleason's National School Climate Survey, which surveys LGBT youth in general, but includes trans youth, and they do have a report on transgender students in general, or transgender students specifically in U.S. schools. So there are sources of information about trans people in the U.S. and how they're doing. So I want to say thank you very much, everybody, for your time and for listening and contributing to the discussion. I think we have 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. So this isn't my last slide, actually. I actually wanted to, in the time that we have left, continue this conversation.
Caro, you're getting some comments.
Oh, okay, sorry.
A lot of people would like to see your PowerPoint. So if since I didn't have people RSVP for today, I don't have the complete list of the 20 people who are here right now. If somebody wants it, should they just email you and you can send it to them?
Yes, that sounds good. Okay. I'll just send you the slides.
Yeah, so you can email either me or Caro, as we both have the slides.
Yeah, I'll send you the most, there's just a couple little edits.
Okay.
I'll send you the most up-to-date one.
Yeah, we can share them that way, and people are saying thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question, Caro, about the term transmasculine, which is a term that I always have a little trouble getting my head around. Can you talk a little more to that?
I think people use the terms transmasculine, transfeminine when they're trying to be inclusive of people who may not firmly binaristically identify as man or woman. So transmasculine is acknowledging sort of a spectrum of masculine identities that includes trans men, but not everybody who identifies as transmasculine might say, yes, I'm a man. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Well, confusing.
It is confusing. Yeah. It gets confusing very quickly because there's such a diversity of how people think about their identities. People use the same term differently. It's kind of squishy.
And I've heard transmasculine used a lot more than transfeminine. Is that just because of what you were saying earlier, that a lot of transmasculine guys tend to be at the forefront of these discussions?
Probably.
Yeah.
It's interesting when you say that the transmasculine voices dominate, given that a lot of these transmasculine people are probably people that were brought up. There's sort of an interesting sociological thing there. If there are people that were brought up as women and sort of socialized in the way that women are, maybe not to speak up as much, and then came to identify as masculine at some point, and then went on to dominate the discussion.
That's interesting. You're getting into something that's like getting into like inside baseball kind of. Because I've had that. I literally recently, this is like me taking off any presenter cap just like in the discussion. I literally recently had that exact discussion with one of my good friends, whose presentation identity is similar to mine.
Yeah.
And because I asked that, I was like, why is this the case?
Yeah.
Because it doesn't seem to be attributable solely to, like, say, white supremacy or solely to, like, patriarchy. It seems like something else is happening. And their opinion was basically that many trans men or transmasculine people who are in positions of leadership in organizations came up through lesbian organizing and lesbian community outreach. And so it's not, so they weren't really like socialized to be quiet, right? They came from a particular kind of community with a particular way of organizing and a particular ethos. So it's not that it's not about racism and that it's not about patriarchy or transmisogyny, but that there is that dimension to it culturally.
Right. It sort of brings the whole nature versus nurture. Yeah. Interesting to think about that. Yeah.
Cultural phenomenon.
There's some questions in the chat box.
to somebody whose name I can't see said, I see femme used a lot. Is that a corollary to transmasculine or something different?
Oh.
That was me, and then I also reflected on it and thought femme can also be inclusive of cis women, maybe. So it's a larger, maybe a large.
I have an opinion. So I'm sure I mean, there may be other trans people here. I'm sure there are other LGBT folks here who have various different opinions and understandings and perspectives on all these different terminologies and their histories.
I do think it's imprecise and can elide structural realities and also sort of historical basis of the term.
Hey,
But
folks, so we just switched to audio. Can people on the line hear us now? Oh, yay. Okay,
Yay,
wonderful.
okay. Wait, I wanted to read.
So let's scroll back up here. I'm going to scroll back up to Frank's comment. That's what you wanted, right?
Yeah. But again, that's my opinion. Other folks may have very different understandings of femme and their various valid perspectives and uses of terms and identities.
Here, do you want
I don't want to steamroll anybody.
All right, so I did see that Frank had a message
That's what we're
about
looking
how
for,
the ICI leadership are not here.
Yeah, I'm
I
gonna.
will, in their defense, say that they're all at the AUCD conference this week.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah.
So it may have been a timing thing.
Yeah.
And we are recording this session.
Yes.
So
Just people know.
I'll just read it though, just so that Frank has his voice heard. I think. This is an important session. This is Frank saying, I'm very disappointed by the lack of attendance from the most senior leadership of both SGISD and ICI. I wish senior leadership would make a more concerted effort to be present for these discussions, since all of us prioritize being present for the discussion. I understand many senior leaders are traveling, but these are people who have... where is it? Okay. These are people who have...
The authority.
The authority to ask for events to be scheduled when they are present. I think this is a culture problem here. So that's Frank's perspective and comment.
thank you, Frank.
And then there's some more comments
Thank
after.
you.
Yes, yes, yes.
But also I want to get into sort of this I don't know how to make this like not be.
Can you just pull that over to the maybe?
I can do that.
Yeah.
And then we're not going to be able to see people's comments for a minute. But basically, I want to be able to have this discussion and hear from everybody instead of just like me sitting here talking at you about my various opinions. So how can we create a culture of trans inclusion here at ICI if indeed we are identifying some cultural problem, despite people being very well-intentioned and people having various different obligations? How do we see the connections between trans inclusion and our work here at ICI? And then what are some concrete next steps that we could take to continue this conversation here? So do folks have perspectives?
So can you make that not full screen, your slideshow, and just hit escape, right? If you do that, that way we can see the questions and then you can open the chat box.
Yes, thank you.
And maybe make it just larger, like down at the bottom where it's 78%. increase that.
See, you are an expert.
Far from it, but there you go, there we go. So now we can,
Okay,
now we can do both, thank you.
yay, now everybody can participate. So what are folks' thoughts, just general thoughts on these questions?
I'll tell you one thing that came to mind immediately for me is currently working on a project with community partners, developing a support network for Native women survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. So then that begs the question, how do trans women fit into that support network and conversation? It's never anything we've explicitly discussed, and we don't say that trans people can or can't participate, it's just not anything that we've really thought of in terms of the framework. We know that there are LGBTQ people who, well, I guess, yeah, so people do participate, but it's not anything that we explicitly said this is an open space for this as well. So it definitely makes me rethink, if we're going to do any additional work in the future, how do we explicitly make sure that trans people recognize that this is an expansive definition?
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. You guys jump in, just talk.
So with regards to the concrete steps that we can take to include trans people here at ICI event, I mean, it's pretty clear that we don't even have a transgender bathroom, which is a huge issue.
You mean like a gender neutral bathroom?
Yes, gender neutral bathroom. And so if we claim to be the Institute for Community Inclusion, the School for Global Inclusion, Social Development, I think at the very least we should have sort of a sign that Caro was talking about, that, you know, we care, right, that we're actually concerned about this issue. And so that should be done at the very least then. So that's just my immediate idea.
Yeah, the sign that Frank saw at Veggie Galaxy.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think the Institute for Community Inclusion, SGISD, I think there's a lot of effort to be inclusive. I think there's hesitation and I think maybe discomfort with the nomenclature, and people classically worried about saying or doing the wrong thing. So I think sessions like these are really critical so that we figure out what the words should be and get comfortable with them and get ideas about signage on bathroom doors. Those are easy steps to take, but it's sort of, you need to feel comfortable asking the questions. Mm-hmm. You need to feel comfortable knowing what resources to tap into to get the answers. And so I think, and not that ignorance is blissful and should be encouraged, I think we do need to remind the ICI SGISD, that we need to be mindful of these things, and I think we all need to own responsibility for bringing things to the attention of particularly Sarah Patterson, since she's our HR link to the leadership and issues that are HR related. And so, personally, as a member of the gay community at the SGISD, and many years ago, that wasn't something we talked about. Mm-hmm. And we formed a diversity committee so we could start talking about language and respect and make the ICI feel a safer place. And here we are, 20-something years later. And we're having these issues as they relate to trans. And I know on the SGISD ICI diversity survey, and Frank and I were both involved in that. We made mistakes in the wording. And I think what's really important is that to own that mistakes will be made, but that those of us that represent communities that are offended by those mistakes or confused or whatever, come forward and say, hey, gentle reminder, there's other ways to do this stuff, and I want to help be part of the solution to this issue, because we're going to make mistakes, and that concern about nomenclature, fear of making mistakes, whatever, we just got to make sure not to hit too hard and punish each other for making mistakes, mm-hmm. but get the message across. And I do think Sarah Patterson is a critical person at the ICI to turn to say, hey, who do I talk to about this? Because I found it problematic. And I think we've come a long way in, the fragrance-free policy that came up because a couple of people said, hey, I have an issue with this, it's affecting us. It wasn't one that it was malicious, it was someone needed to bring it to someone's attention so that we can act on it. And Frank, I hear your concern about the leadership, and I do think we should encourage the leadership to listen to this recorded session. So I think that's a really good point. So I'll stop talking because I can talk for
Thank you. I don't remember the issue of gender neutral bathrooms coming up when we were renovating this space 3 years ago. And I think it's probably too bad that it didn't come up then, because I don't think it's something that people would have been opposed to then, and it would be much harder to do now.
I think there were restrictions given with the building to accommodate that there was going to be a men's and a women's. I think signage is the way to go, but again, it's an important issue to bring up.
Right. So Quinn is saying in the comments, I asked about it during the renovation. The bathrooms were not done by us. They came from the building. Somebody else, Allison Hall, was expressing agreement, with what some of the stuff that you were saying earlier. Allison Taylor was mentioning that she also wished that there was disturbed to see, or would have preferred that there's a gender neutral bathroom here. And somebody else mentioned Sarah Patterson as a resource to keep looping into these discussions.
We're lucky to have
more of these, right?
More discussions like this?
Hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully.
Yeah. We're lucky that, the university, everybody goes to HR for everything. We're lucky to have our own internal resource for HR-related issues. So we're lucky to have Sarah, and she's on the executive team, so she's at the leadership table. So great resource to tap into.
Right.
I also, sorry.
Yeah, someone online speaking?
Yeah, I think so.
This is Allison Taylor. I was just going to say, I just wanted to make a comment about the question, how do we see the connections between trans inclusion and our work? And I think somebody said, if we're the Institute for Community Inclusion, we need to be inclusive in all ways. And I think that also translates to our work, our research, our, all of the work that we do here at ICI, that we need to be intersectional in every way. So we need to be thinking about how gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic class, and LGBT and Q, as well as trans issues are important in terms of people with disabilities who also have other marginalized identities, experience the world in particular ways, and are affected in particular ways by the systems that are not inclusive or that oppress people. So I think that Caro's work, I really enjoyed your short presentation at the staff meeting, and I think that we need to be thinking more about how to be intentional about intersectionality in our work more broadly.
Thanks, Allison.
Yeah.
We're almost out of time. I think we have time for one more comment. And Cedric, I saw that you had something.
Yeah, I had a question. And this is me putting on my instructor hat. When I teach my grad students, there are 14 of them. I know all their names. My undergrads are 35, whole different ball game. So in relation to pronouns, I mean, I'm just being candid. If I can't remember their first names, the likelihood of me remembering whichever pronoun happens to be their preferred one is slim to none. I mean, am I safe just using they or theirs in referencing to their comment about this if I don't remember their proper name?
I think so. I think that gender neutral pronouns, defaulting to them if you're not sure is safe.
Okay.
There are pedagogical strategies for Like sometimes I've had professors just ask in class, like when they do like sort of attendance on the first day, like ask folks' name and then also their pronouns if they're willing to share that, and then they like say, like would mark that next to the name on the roster. I had one women's studies professor who gave us all index cards on the first day and like asked us some basic information, so like how we would like to be addressed in terms of our name in class, and then also what our pronoun is, what pronoun we'd like to be addressed as. And then that way, sort of, she had access to that, and if we didn't feel comfortable saying our preferred pronoun for whatever reason in front of our classmates, excuse me, she was able to accommodate us in terms of what we wanted her to call us. So those are just a couple of strategies that I've like actually encountered as a student that seemed to work pretty well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Caro, for this presentation.
Yeah, thank you all for your Thank you.
Want to hit the recording button?
Yes.
Thank you.